Welcome to the DANSOX Virtual Summer School. My name is Marcus, and today I'm going to be talking about Pina Bausch and the tragic, and this is the third lecture. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Sue Jones for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank you to everyone who's watching at home or wherever you might be. So today I'm going to be talking about Pina Bausch, the Tanztheater Wuppertal, and its relationship to both the classical and the postmodern, particularly looking at the tragic or tragedy. So just a quick methodological point before we start. The postmodern in dance has a particular valency that comes from a historical moment in dance practice, where a group of artists working together, including people like the Judson Dance Theatre and Yvonne Rainer, coming out of the 60s, are using modes of live art, of performance art, to really react against modern dance. I mean, we see this in Yvonne Rainer's famous No manifesto, which says no to spectacle, no to magic, no to transformations. So there's lots of brilliant scholarship on postmodern dance, and Yvonne Rainer and other people who form that group. Someone like Sally Baines is really good to check out for this. I can also recommend Tom Hastings, who's a lecturer and practitioner working at the London Contemporary Dance School at the place. So my research on the postmodern and dance takes the postmodern both as this historical moment, but also more broadly as a kind of theoretical set of practices which work to disrupt the representations in modern dance. So I'm examining the politics, the embodied, the social, the ideational and material, working around kind of the postmodern and criticisms of the postmodern too. So thinking about postmodernity as a problem of provocation in this way allows me to kind of hold truck with the experimental, the weirder moments in dance practice. And I'm particularly focused on how troubling this kind of modes of representation broadly as a category of theory and practice intersects with the classical, this thing called the classical, which is both the specter of ancient Greek and Rome, but also classical technique, so classical ballet technique and things like that. So today, I'm going to be talking about a small section of my research, which focuses on the Tanztheater Wuppertal's 1982 piece, Nelken, or Carnations. I'm going to be describing a moment from the work to not breach any copyright laws, and then I'm also going to outline how that moment puts the tragic into play. So, in Nelken, a row of dancers, all in dresses, already dripping with sweat, make gestures on chairs, moving almost in unison. We can see this in the photo above, that they're brief movement phrases based on rocking, and as they go back, their hands come up above their heads, and then they go forward and bring them down across their bodies. They're moving in counterpoint against the rhythm of the music at a kind of a really swift and light pace. Eventually, Dominic Mercy, who we see in the center of the frame here, stops, turns to his right, and places his head on his hand. The others notice, they stand up and mob him. They pull at the dress, which is elegantly draped over his body, and the black cotton sticks to him as he's dragged through the space. He starts to yell that it wasn't him, that he didn't do it, begging them to stop, but they don't listen. His failure to win out over this attack is held viscerally in his arms and his back. His head is bowed to protect it from their fists and their dragging. And he's not really fighting back so much against them, but struggling in a kind of awareness that he knows that he's being overwhelmed here. He eventually starts to scream no, louder and louder, getting wild with desperation, and then they stop. Mercy leaves the stage as if he's an actor, kind of storming out of a rehearsal room or a lover exiting an apartment to document this moment of him walking away of something that is both factual and fictional. While he walks into the background, another dancer steps forward into the frame, into the front of the stage, and thanks the audience for being there with them tonight. It is at this moment that Mercy then turns on his heels, burns through the space, and confronts the other dancers, yelling at them to remove the boxes and chairs which clutter the space, to create room for him. He then confronts the audience, yelling at them too, asking them if this is what they wanted to see, if this is what they paid for. And this is when he begins to do what we can see in the photo. He begins to perform balletic tricks. So he begins to ask them if they want to see a tour en l'air, a jeté, piqué turns, and then he performs these tricks, these balletic tricks for them. And the coup de theatre is in their response. Even under this confrontation from him, they clap and cheer. This is Dominic Mercy, using classical ballet technique in a moment of rupture, in a moment of decomposition of the structure of the piece. He allows it to fill his throat and to shape the way that his body is moving until an officer, someone called the Master of Ceremonies, appears on stage, remands Mercy, and tells him that he needs to put on some proper clothes. The Tanztheater Wuppertal's staging of suffering challenges the ontology of representation in dance and provokes, although it does not necessarily entail, questions about grievability and mourning on stage in post-war Germany. Their practice of exploring complicated and often ineffable affective structures through collage or montage is one which is deeply entangled with efforts to perform or stage versions of the apparatuses of control of the state, alongside their concerted interest in making works which investigate the sex-gender binary, class, and later race in their works. The Tanztheater Wuppertal often come up against questions or issues about state control and violence, collective trauma, memory, national identity. In this section from Nelken, the montage of these successive scenes which I've described facilitate a movement into and out of different systems of bodily control and discipline, revealing how questions of subjecthood and identity are stitched into the architectures of state power. In the section from Nelken which I described, the performers make visible real episodes of terror and violence from within a theatricalized police state. They also reveal the ways in which choreography interprets reality. This threatens to frustrate the grounds of representation on which modern dance stands normally. So, in thinking about representations which may have the structure of a tragedy, I wanted to kind of address that what most spectators do find quite difficult about witnessing a Bausch work, and here I have an image from their piece, He Takes Her by the Hand and Leads Her into the Castle, which is their adaptation of Macbeth. What spectators have found difficult and what commentators frequently note about them is their methods of defying ways of seeing and confronting the audience, even denying that the audience's expectations for what they might witness in seeing a dance piece. In this work particularly, commentators and even dancers walked out of rehearsals saying that there wasn't any dance. This moment comes in a turning point for the company after in 74, where they do Rite of Spring and and Orpheus and Eurydice, just following Iphigenia and Tauris. So, as Bausch scholar Royd Klemenka summarizes, Bausch's works refuse foreclosure. They present the uncomfortable reality of the everyday, and they remain open and in process. Other scholars say the pieces are like dreams or musical collages, associative investigations of love, care, loss, grief, memory, or even space for making the mundane surreal and the surreal mundane. Part of the joy of Bausch's work, of witnessing these evenings, sometimes 3 and 4 hours long, comes from their refusal to be put into language, their continuous frustration of our attempts to pin them down in words in writing, or in speech and conversations with someone to describe what even happened. What did we witness? As dance scholar Andrew Lepecki describes in his monograph Exhausting Dance, theoretically, the critique of representation announces a fracture in the epistemological regime of modernity, a regime that rested on a faith in the reality effect of representation as it secured the stability of discourse. He notes that after Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectics of enlightenment and deconstruction work, which he cites all of Derrida, these kind of shifts, these critiques in representation have precipitated this epistemological fracture in the reality effect of representation in order to reveal how it reproduces and performs forms of domination. So we see here that there's clearly a part of the impulse behind the critique of representation is a critique of the ways in which those representations claim or represent structures of power, how they kind of put them back onto the things that they're describing, the worlds that they're showing. German director and playwright Heine Müller puts this kind of contested spectatorship in conversations with tragedy specifically. Müller explains this in an interview where he outlines how he's outlining how geometrical structures and anxieties work in dance, so it's a little bit of a conceptual conversation. And then in the middle of this, he turns to Bausch, and he has a reflection on witnessing the company's works. So he says, when I was young, I saw ballet. The ballet seemed completely superfluous to me, and then 12 or 15 years ago, I saw 6 or 8 productions by Pina Bausch. They impressed me enormously and irritated me a lot. In fact, I was disturbed, because for the first time in Germany, I saw representations which had the structure of tragedy, which one rarely finds in the theatre. It was suddenly something that was very close to me and that immediately moved me without text. And as I'm condemned to write text for the theatre, it was a disturbance, and it persists. So as a contemporary German artist to Bausch, Müller is engaging with similar questions than she is. They're both thinking about how or whether we can even put forward or create meaning after the horrors and catastrophes of World War II. Both establish spaces for exploration and experimentation in Germany, and both confront the ties between state control violence and ancient Greek and Roman tragedies. This reading is not lost on more recent commentators. In a program note for a double bill of Café Müller and The Rite of Spring from Sadler's Wells in 2008, dance critic and lecturer James Woodall goes as far as to say that in Bausch, who understands dance from the inside and long ago found classicism wanting, sense runs headlong into the unexpected, unusually inarticulable catastrophes that shape our lives and psyches and losses. Some would call that the definition of tragedy. This wager is given more weight even by another dance scholar from Stanford, Janice Ross, who notes in a presidential lecture at Stanford in 1999 that in the 15 years since Bausch's first appearance in Los Angeles, American postmodern dance has found its own way into the territory of loss, mortality, and pain that initially seemed almost exclusively the province of Bausch. Ross says that this is because of AIDS and the specter of massive tragedy and sorrow that now haunts dance makers and locales far broader than Germany and Japan. The fact that the rest of the world, Ross says, has first-hand experience with Bausch's vision is a sad, not joyous reality. It does, however, invite us to regard her works as prophetic in some way of the richest and most disquieting art can be. So what these three perspectives give us is a sense of the kinds of tragedy, what people mean when they say that Bausch's work is tragic or has the structure of a tragedy. It's not always explicitly ancient Greek, but it is tied to suffering, catastrophe, and the surreal nature of daily violence and loss, especially when those daily violences and losses are considered to be constitutive of a larger reality. Ross's example of the HIV/AIDS crisis throws Woodall's comment about Bausch's work being something like the definition of tragedy into stark relief when we hear that Bausch's practice was then prefiguring the way into which the postmodern dancers expressed loss and grief. While this comparison is figural and is itself a comparison and has limits, it is useful for honing in on one feature which triangulates Bausch and Müller, the reckoning with this specter of massive tragedy. In this interview, where the screen grab comes from, Bausch struggles to answer the question posed to her by filmmaker Chantal Akerman. Akerman has just asked Bausch, what does she hope for herself in the future? Bausch takes an incredible amount of time pausing and reflecting on this before finally saying something like, I can't hope for anything for myself in a future where there's so much pain and suffering going on around me right now. Bausch has always been reflective on the facts that her works take place or reflect in some way reality. She says that they are kind of attempts to replicate or do reality on stage. That's what she's interested in. But Bausch's works have particular techniques for doing this, and they often rely on theatre. So she takes things like Grotowskian portrayals of cruelty, Brecht's alienation effect, and uses them in her work to create a confrontation between the audience and the dancers. Lepecki, who we heard from earlier, describes this as a break with the tradition of choreographic composition and subjectivity. And he recalls Bausch's famous idiom that what matters for her was not how people move, but what moves people. Lepecki goes on to describe how trans theatre comes out of this deep dialogue with anti-representational strategies, which are deployed by postmodern artists in America in the 70s. In the example I described from Nelken, the confrontation with representational strategies of modernism are the same tools for confronting the spectre of massive tragedy. This functions through a series of aspect-to-aspect transitions, which I described at the beginning and will now return to. So the montage itself is a deconstruction of narrative order, shifting not according to relations of action, i.e. one thing causally leads to another, but shifting instead through perspective, through emotion, through feeling. We start with the phrase of typically Bauschian choreography, the arm phrase performed on the chair, repeated again and again to show the strain on the body of doing her work, and the iterability of this moment happening again and again, the same thing repeated through time, slipping as it goes. This is a reflection on control or surrender to choreography as a group, as a collective. It is the repetition of the rehearsal room. Then the phrase is deconstructed. It is torn apart with violence through a shift in weight and gravity, through a collision in which the dancers surround Mercy and attack him. The body's relationship to time and space shift, so that while they attack Mercy, we do not witness the repetition of one segment of time replayed over and over again, but a durational episode. The same actions, pulling, tugging, pushing, repeated again and again through time, a continuous present that the audience is confronted with and has to sit and watch. The violence itself is ideological, it is a political reflection. It's a group of people mobbing one person on stage, and it reflects and echoes forms and moments of collective violence that we witness in public, often used to create an other, to create someone who is separate from the group. So it pushes Mercy and his dress out and away from the rest of them in theirs. There's two different kinds of collective as well, this unison collective, this kind of Greek pop chorus that we see up here all moving at the same time together, and then the second, much more angry mob collective, this different kind of chorality which comes after. And it's from this second collectivity which Mercy emerges as a singular person. Again, another shift based on aspect or perspective rather than causal action. He emerges out of the chorus and confronts the audience, taking control over the group even and choreographing their actions, telling them to move boxes and things around the space. And this is a further deconstruction of this first chorus line that we see on the chairs now, in which Mercy is voicing the orders which shape their movements through space. After this, he dances and performs ballet tricks, confronting the audience even more and putting more strain on his body. The classical manifesting inside this rupture, him speaking the actions as well, is self-consciously framing what he's doing as a site of viewing pleasure for the audience, and it reckons with the act of performing for them. He asks those questions that become screams, is this what you want to see? Is this really it? I can do what you want. And he confronts them with what they've paid to see, with the very act that they have bought tickets in order to be here, for his body to be put through this ringer for them. And then after that, Mercy is eventually confronted by the police officer, the warden of control, who puts Mercy back in his place, who shuts down his confrontation with the audience itself and reminds us that what Mercy is really part of is a representational strategies to put into play a system of a police state. This is kind of our moment of reckoning with this thorny issue of tragic pleasure. In Aristotle's Poetics, Book 1, we're told that witnessing tragedy itself is pleasurable because it allows the spectator the opportunity to remember the ones that they are mourning. We hear reflected by scholar Fiona McIntosh in Dying Acts, the same fact is happening in Irish tragedies which center around public mourning, that the pleasure that comes from this act of witnessing is itself part of going, part of paying, but it's in this instance we're being reminded that mercy is the one that's allowing us to do this, right? It's his trained body, it's his presence, it's his being there that's facilitating this action, and he makes us very aware of this. So this is the typical Bauschian punchline, right? The rules of escape are set up to allow the performer to get out, to confront the audience, to escape from the kind of the system of control of representation of modern dance, of ballet, those building blocks of order. He's allowed to escape that and has this moment of confrontation, but then the same rules that allow him to escape are the ones that bring him back down into the system. They catch him out in an unexpected way and remind us that this was always already a performative act, always already contained within the theatre space. And these postmodern methods of critique of deconstruction, pastiche, rupture, distancing effect, confrontation, are here trained to allow for one moment of mass systemic violence to appear among the detritus of this everyday, for it to only fade away again. So by way of a coda, I just wanted to note and reflect on how this section of Nelken, as I've been describing it, has been framed by another artist. Maybe some of you will recognize her from the screen grab put up, but the documentary is made by Chantal Akerman, the Belgian feminist filmmaker. And the section of footage comes from a moment in the documentary on the Tanztheater Wuppertal. And really, Akerman is amazing in creating this documentary because she hones her use of montage, of editing, in a way that captures the same sense and feeling of a Bausch piece. So it is really, really like watching a Bausch dance, even though it is a film. The fundamental principle in her work is this montage, influenced by Sergei Eisenstein, who is a filmmaker who played on the idea of montage, using it to create ideas and meaning between the cuts in the transitions. So meaning is amplified by transitions used, and duration, the techniques of fading in and out between the different shots. And this is one of the reasons why the documentary itself works so beautifully. In Akerman's work more broadly, the tragic is a prominent figuration. It's a means for exploring the pain experienced by women every day in society, for drawing out and extending through long durations of film time the results of those techniques of the body which ascribe binary gender. Tragedy for Akerman is the process by which hierarchical gender model is constructed, reenacted, replayed on the body on a day-to-day level. Akerman uses this technique to work through this film, which we see a screenshot here, Jean Dielman, which is a 3-hour look at 2 days in the life of this woman. The way that Akerman describes this scene from the film, this potato peeling scene, and the moments after it, the next day, she describes it as a tragedy, as an ancient Greek tragedy, and says that it is as if the tragedy arrives in the film from pretty much nothing at all. This nothing, I think, is important because Akerman doesn't mean that there's nothing going on, surely, that there's no cuts, no editing, no performance from the actress. Instead, I wager that this nothing is actually a description of something else. It's tragedy appearing from an unexpected angle, from somewhere where you wouldn't think that it would come from, and if you were standing normally, you wouldn't see it appearing. It comes from nowhere, from nothing. This is the same place from which Derrida describes his view of tragedy, reflecting on how Plato says that tragedy is not kind of gotten rid of by philosophy, but is actually displaced. It's put somewhere else. It's not the thing that's visible anymore, but it's the thing that structures or makes the visible possible. And we can see this in dance techniques, we can see this in Jean Dielman. This nowhere that tragedy comes from is the kind of the thing that's outside the frame, the thing that's sitting outside, potentially even making the framing possible. The camera, the lights, the editing, the technique of the body of the dancer that makes their performance possible. Conceptually, this kind of outside the frame could also be memories of war or fantasies of war that allow that to be put into play in the scene itself. And because Nelken so forcefully shifts the ground on which the spectator stands to experience a performance, it manages to create this critique of modernist representational strategies by bringing the tragic in. By surrealizing the mundane and domesticating the surreal, Nelken puts an ontological challenge to the ways in which reality is represented, reenacted through choreography. Because it focuses on the vulnerability of the body in resistance, because it zeroes in on suffering, it challenges the ontology of representational structures in dance, modern dance, which often abstracted the body, or made it geometric, or made it representative of a myth, of a story, of a narrative. The Tanztheater of Wuppertal instead provokes the spectator to be confronted with what that process of abstraction means, what it does to the body of the dancer, leaving still the question to be answered on how and in what way the dancers themselves become grievable. In what way potentially Bausch's theatre and her practice of dance allows us to mourn for the performers themselves. And it raises these certain questions, particularly on stage in a post-war Germany. Thank you so much for your time and for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them over. There will be an online webinar. The email address that you want in order to send those questions through is development.office@st.hilda's.ox.ac.uk. That's a dash between St and Hilda's, but no apostrophe before the S. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to Sue Jones for inviting me to be here. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the virtual summer school.